I was asked a few weeks ago why I decided to sit down one October day and start drafting this script, a video with a title that's almost guaranteed to send a certain demographic of the internet feral. Well, to take a page out of an Australian car video creator called Spotto.
Somebody's gotta charge the electric eels crew!
Arise, ye workers, from your slumber. Arise, ye prisoners of want. That's right. For reason in revolt now thunder. Chains of hatred, greed, and fear.
Now that the mental insanity has commenced, we will get started. Oh, and just to cut the comments off, I'm not British, so think of another insult. I should start with saying I'm not saying British tanks alone stop the fall of Moscow. That would be just silly. At the end of the day, these are just big metal boxes with boomsticks. They lack the required meat sacks filled with anxiety to do anything by themselves. And yes, I'm sorry 40k fans, the machine spirit is not real. Yet. The reality is that Moscow is saved by the lives of Soviet citizens. No, not just Russians, Soviets. That includes Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Uzbekis, and about 30 other ethnic groups that Russia likes to pretend are just Russians. These lives are what stopped the German advance, and that and the overextended German supply lines on a lot of snow. But to stop this advance they needed tools, and one of the most important tools when fighting the German army in World War II was tanks. But therein lies the rub, because the USSR in 1941 only had a handful of designs that could actually stand against the larger German tanks, and that could actually, survive. These of course included the KVs and the T-34s, but they simply weren't enough, not even slightly. So what would stand in and fill that gap? What would hold the positions? What would go into the forest? What would be the stopgap? Well, the answer is something that really upsets a lot of people. Because it's British tanks. We all know how the story goes. On the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany launched the invasion of the Soviet Union under the name of Operation Barbarossa. This date signaled the beginning of one of the most vicious, brutal, and certainly largest land campaigns in history. Both Germany and the USSR entered the conflict with enormous armoured forces, reflecting the central role tanks were going to play in a modern war. But within weeks of the invasion, the Red Army's armoured strength was in complete tatters. Now, it is true that German tank formations also suffered significant attrition, but the sheer scale of losses being experienced by the USSR during these opening months is genuinely mind-boggling. At the start of the invasion, the Wehrmacht deployed roughly 3,300 tanks and assault guns across 3 army groups. The majority of these German tanks were models such as the 38T, Panzer III, and IV, with support from the older Panzer models. Of course, there were also your Stugs and other armoured vehicles. These tanks were organised into panzer divisions that themselves were integrated with mechanised infantry, artillery and air support, with the purpose of deep striking columns of combined arms. You may know it as Blitzkrieg. The majority of the German army still walked and used a lot of horses, and they were, well, in many cases too slow to follow these columns. We call it combined arms warfare now, but everyone knows it as Blitzkrieg these days, even if it's wrong, thanks History Channel. Now, historically, this kind of strategy had proven its worth in places like France and Poland. But in the USSR, with the Soviets' massive numerical armour advantage and sheer size, surely this should have been impossible. Just to give you an idea on the numbers here, the Soviet Union possessed officially over 22,000 tanks. Yes, I said officially, because in reality this figure is misleading. The majority of Soviet tanks were older designs, such as the T-26 light tank and the BT series, which while successful against Japan at Khalkhin Gol, were totally outmatched in 1941. To make matters worse, many of these tanks were in various stages of operation and functionality, rusting in the open, broken down, and well, you get the picture. The actual number of modern tanks that had a chance against the Germans was about 1,500, and this includes the KV-1s, KV-2s, and the early T-34s. 1,500, that's it, of the 22,000. And that is before we even get into how poorly structured and integrated these modern tanks were into Soviet formations. Things are no bueno. With what we have just covered, you will not at all be shocked to hear that the opening weeks of Barbarossa saw the Wehrmacht achieve extraordinary operational success. Using surprise, superior coordination, and concentrated armoured spearheads, German forces penetrated deep into Soviet lines, encircled vast numbers of Red Army troops, and really within days the entire Soviet mechanised corps were shattered. By early July, German forces advanced hundreds of kilometres into Soviet territory, seizing Minsk, Smolensk, and parts of Ukraine. While this was happening, tank losses on the Soviet side can only be described as catastrophic. According to archival records, the Red Army lost approximately 11,000 tanks in the first 2 weeks alone. 11,000, that's nearly half of the USSR's pre-war inventory. Keep in mind this does include abandoned and broken down, not just destroyed, so just keep that in mind, but 11,000 effectively out of the game. By the end of July 1941, Soviet tank losses had risen to around 15 to 17,000 vehicles. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht lost about 600 to 1,000 tanks in the same period, with many being recoverable after German forces advanced beyond where they had been knocked out. But what was the exact cause of this disparity, you may ask? Well, there are a few key reasons. First and foremost, in 1941, the Red Army was still in the midst of trying to put the absolute mess that had been caused by Stalin's purges back together. Any Hoi 4 player will know that. This included the complete reorganization of units, command structures, and the whole military across all branches. To give you an idea of how bad it got, Stalin's government only had just begun reforming mechanized corps, which under Red Army doctrine were theoretically large armoured formations consisting of up to 1,000 tanks each. In practice, these corps lacked trained staff officers, radio equipment, and logistical infrastructure. Now, it was never anything like the movie Enemy at the Gates, the one with the rifle shoots, the one without it follows and picks it up line, but it was bad. When the German invasion began, the Soviet tank units were scattered, often deployed piecemeal, with no coordination, barely any air support, if any, and that opened them up to the Luftwaffe, which quickly gained air supremacy over the battlefront. With air supremacy seized, the Germans could destroy Soviet tanks both on the ground and during transit along their supply lines. Fuel and ammunition shortages would compound this problem even further. See, a lot of people don't realize the USSR had a lot of oil, but getting that fuel to the front was so difficult to do. Many Soviet armoured units simply just ran out of supplies, and this led to their vehicles being left along the side of the road and then being captured by the Germans. In some sectors, more than half of the Soviet tank losses were due to mechanical breakdowns or lack of fuel, rather than direct combat. Those mechanical breakdowns were key, because while the T-34 and KV series were formidable machines, early production models suffered frequent mechanical failures. This included broken transmissions, overheating engines. The older BT and T-26 tanks, meanwhile, were torn apart by German anti-tank weaponry, and could not operate effectively on rough terrain. Spare parts were scarce, and maintenance crews were poorly trained as well. As a result, even surviving tanks were often immobilized within days of deployment. I should add here, though, that when the T-34s and KVs worked, the Germans did absolutely struggle to deal with them. There just simply wasn't enough of them to stop the German advance. Soviet tank formations in those early days also had a tremendous handicap when you compare them to the Germans, who benefited from superior doctrine and communication, and really well experienced too. Every German tank was equipped with a radio, allowing for real-time coordination during a battle. A luxury most Soviet tanks lacked. German combined arm tactics integrated tanks with artillery, infantry, and engineers, and close air support, and this enabled that rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, whereas the Soviet tank attacks were frontal and unsupported, and this just led to heavy casualties and not much more gained. While the German losses were modest compared to the Soviet disaster, they were not insignificant. By August 1941, around 1,000 German tanks had been destroyed or rendered unserviceable, and this accounted for roughly 1/3 of the armoured strength when Barbarossa began. Similar to the Soviets, many losses were due to mechanical wear rather than combat. The sheer size of the USSR, with its poor roads and constant movement, strained the engines and suspensions, and supply lines, they just couldn't keep up. This is a tale as old as time when it comes to Barbarossa. As the German spearheads advanced further west, their tank losses began to accumulate faster than replacements could actually arrive from Germany. The Wehrmacht's armoured forces, while tactically superior, were numerically inadequate for a war of such scale, but as things were progressing, the German spearheads were only being stopped by their own lack of supplies. Something would have to give. Either the Soviets would need to dig in and build more tanks, but then again, how could they do that when Ukraine, the industrial heartland of the Soviet Empire, and Western Russia, was now under occupation? Sure, some factories had gotten away to the Urals, but they weren't ready to provide the modern tanks in the numbers that the USSR needed. Something would have to give soon because the Germans were pushing towards Moscow. Although the lend-lease program is most often associated with the United States, Britain also provided extensive material support to the USSR, especially in those critical early years. When Barbarossa began, the Soviet Union suffered catastrophic losses in men, losses we just covered in equipment and industrial capacity. And when I mean catastrophic, you remember that figure, over 10,000 in 1941 alone. The British, meanwhile, recognising that the USSR's survival was crucial to defeating Hitler, extended immediate aid before even the formal American lend-lease system was fully implemented. This assistance was driven not only by strategic necessity, but also by Winston Churchill's direct decision to support the USSR despite the hostile ideological differences and the need for British reinforcements in Africa. See, Britain needed its own tanks to fight the Germans in Africa, but the USSR needed them more. British supplies in these early days included aircraft such as the Hawker Hurricane, vehicles, raw materials, food, you name it, everything, and of course, tanks. Generally, these were of the Matilda and Valentine variety, though there were a few others that were sent, but these were the main two. And it must be said these tanks were highly valued by Soviet forces during the early stages of the war when the BTs were flailing and the gaps between the KVs and 34s on the front was huge. Beyond just weaponry, Britain provided logistical and economic assistance to the USSR, with convoys travelling to the dangerous Arctic route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk carrying essential goods including fuel, steel, machine tools, medical supplies, and clothing. These shipments were crucial in maintaining Soviet industrial output, especially as many factories were being torn down and relocated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. The British role also included technical cooperation and training, as British engineers and specialists worked with Soviet counterparts to ensure the effective use and maintenance of the supplied equipment. What we will be focusing on today, though, is the impact these British tanks had when the USSR was on the brink and the Germans were on the outskirts of Moscow. It was the British tanks that rolled in to help throw the Germans back, working within the Red Army structure in a role that is quite often underreported and in many cases today ignored. By autumn 1941, the Soviet Union was on the edge of catastrophe following the months of constant battering by the Wehrmacht. Operation Barbarossa had shattered the Red Army through the encirclements and annihilation that saw the USSR's tank force completely destroyed, and by the time the Wehrmacht initiated Operation Typhoon, the final offensive aimed at Moscow, Soviet tank forces had been depleted to a complete shadow of their pre-war strength. Entire mechanized corps by this point had ceased to exist. Their tanks destroyed or abandoned amid the chaotic retreats, yet as the German forces surged towards the Soviet capital, their supply lines themselves were at a limit, slowing the German advance itself. And this gave the Soviets a bit of time to throw out a few tricks that they had held up their sleeves through emergency production, hurried reorganisation, and deliveries of lend-lease equipment from Britain, forming the building blocks to throw the Germans back. On the 2nd of October 1941, German Army Group Centre unleashed Operation Typhoon. It was a massive offensive intended to encircle and destroy the remaining Soviet forces and capture Moscow before winter set in. Now, sidebar, it's become a common thing here for people to say, oh, if the Germans took Moscow, the USSR would surrender. I blame history documentaries in the 90s for this, because it's not going to be a thing. It probably would not have. The USSR would have lost a significant railway hub, population centre and industrial base, but the USSR is not going to surrender just because Moscow falls. We know this because during the start of the battle, the USSR had already begun to move its government out of the city, but we'll get to that in a minute. The loss of Moscow, while devastating, does not mean the USSR dies. It just means that it gets harder. Anyway, back to Operation Typhoon. The German offensive initially went very well and exactly according to plan, with the 4th Panzer Group advancing through the centre and countering minimal resistance. It would then split its mobile forces, with one element moving north to link up with the 3rd Panzer Group to complete the encirclement of Vyazma, while another headed south to help the 2nd Panzer Group close a ring around Soviet forces in Bryansk. Soviet defensive positions were still incomplete, and they were quickly overrun, and the spearheads of the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups met at Vyazma on the 10th of October 1941. Within this pocket, 4 Soviet armies, the 16th, 19th, 20th and 24th, along with a part of the 32nd, were trapped, but despite the encirclement, and despite the hopelessness of it, the Soviet forces continued to resist, forcing the Wehrmacht to commit 28 divisions to eliminate this pocket, units that might otherwise have supported the drive on Moscow. The remnants of the Western and Reserve fronts withdrew to establish new defensive positions along the Mosaic Line. Although the casualties were severe, some Soviet units managed to break out in small groups, ranging from platoons to entire divisions. Crucially, and this is largely underreported, it was the encircled divisions resisting the Germans that bought crucial time for Moscow to reinforce, with units arriving from the east. Weather conditions soon deteriorated in the Soviets' favour too. On the 7th of October, the first snowfall quickly turned to mud, creating the infamous Rasputitsa that transformed roads into impassable quagmires. This severely slowed the German army units, which bought further time and allowed Soviet forces to withdraw in a better order, while those other encircled groups still fought on. In certain areas, the Red Army was able to mount small counterattacks to blunt the German spearheads, such as on the 6th of October near Metensk, where the 4th Panzer Division was ambushed by Dmitry Lulashenko's improvised 1st Guard Special Corps. Concealed T-34 tanks struck German armour as it advanced, attacking from flanks and inflicting heavy damage. Much has been made of this engagement as an example of the T-34's supremacy. However, the facts show that this was a small engagement that showed the effectiveness of a planned operation utilising cover and concealment, rather than the T-34 being some kind of wonder weapon. Additionally, Soviet counterattacks would further slow the German advance as the Second Army, operating North Guderian's forces, faced strong pressure from Red Army units supported by air power. German estimates claim 673,000 Soviets were captured in the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets, although recent research suggests this figure is closer to 514,000. Whether it was 763 or 514,000, it represented a horrifically devastating loss. Doesn't matter whether it was the big one or the small one, it's still a horrific loss that's almost half of the Soviet forces in the sector. On the 9th of October, German propaganda announced that the destruction of Moscow's defending armies was imminent, greatly boosting German morale and fueling hopes of a swift victory in a similar vein to the defeat of France. Yet, Soviet resistance continued to delay the Wehrmacht. When German forces reached the Mozhaisk defensive line west of Moscow on the 10th of October, they encountered newly formed Soviet defences. On the same day, Georgy Zhukov assumed command of the defensive line and ordered the concentration of all available forces along the now strengthened fortifications. On the 15th of October, Stalin ordered the evacuation of much of the Soviet government to Kuybyshev, triggering a panic and mass attempts by civilians to flee Moscow. Crowds would then overwhelm transport systems and clog roads, but Stalin's decision to remain in the capital did help restore a degree of calm and stability. Essentially, the Germans were being held outside the city, but the reality was things were very precarious, and either they had to be thrown back, or it was just a matter of time until they dug in, built their strength, and pushed forward. At the beginning of Operation Typhoon, Soviet forces defending the Moscow Axis possessed approximately 990 tanks spread across the Western Reserve and Bryansk fronts. This included a mix of T-34s and KV-1s, but this was smaller in numbers. The majority of Soviet tanks in this early stage of the war were still the T-26s and BT series that were increasingly vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. However, after the disaster of the Vyazma-Bryansk encirclements, this number fell to roughly only 700 or so operational tanks by late October, many of them worn out and undersupplied. It was here that the Valentines and the Matildas began to arrive, as Britain became the first major Western ally to provide the Soviet Union with tanks under lend-lease. These shipments began in the latter half of 1941, carried by the perilous Arctic convoys and later through Iran, navigating German U-boats, surface raiders and harsh weather conditions, en route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, being escorted by Royal Navy ships completely caked in ice. By December 1941, approximately 466 British tanks had reached Soviet territory, and this consisted of roughly 187 operational Matilda IIs and 216 operational Valentines. Not all were immediately combat ready though, as many required assembly, repair, and some testing after a long voyage at sea. To make matters worse, the numbers were actually lower than they were supposed to be because of the losses to U-boats, but by the time of the Soviet counteroffensive in early December, approximately 200 to 230 British tanks were completely operational in the Moscow area. This force included about 100 Matilda IIs and 130 Valentines that would find themselves directly involved in crucial fighting around the capital. By early December 1941, on the eve of the Soviet counteroffensive, the Red Army had rebuilt its armoured forces to approximately about 1,500 to 1,700 tanks around the Moscow area. During the counteroffensive itself, this figure rose further to roughly 1,800 to 2,000 tanks as new brigades were formed and damaged vehicles were returned to service. As the German offensive stalled, Wehrmacht intelligence incorrectly concluded that the Red Army had exhausted its reserves and it could not mount a proper counteroffensive. This assessment proved gravely mistaken though. Acting on information from spy Richard Sorge that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East, Stalin had redeployed substantial forces from Siberia and eastern regions including more than 18 divisions, 1,700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft. By early December, the Soviets had amassed a reserve of 58 whole divisions. And thanks to the time bought by the encircled Red Army forces and of course the winter, the forces already in Moscow were able to be equipped and reinforced. Therefore, when Zhukov and Vasilevsky's counteroffensive plan was finally approved, the Red Army would actually field around 1.1 million troops. While this only slightly exceeded German manpower overall, careful concentration of the forces meant that the Red Army would have local superiority. The Soviet counteroffensive officially began on the 5th of December 1941 on the Kalinin front, followed by the northwestern and western fronts the next day. The initial progress was slow, but the momentum soon built. Soviet troops recaptured villages on the outskirts on the 12th of December through to the 15th, forcing Guderian's forces into a rapid withdrawal to the west. The pressure relieved the immediate threat to Tula and began pushing the German forces away from Moscow's outskirts. Facing the unexpected Soviet offensive, Hitler issued Directive Order No. 39 on the 8th of December, ordering German troops to adopt a defensive posture. However, frontline commanders found their positions untenable and began withdrawing to more defensive lines, against Hitler's explicit orders. The limited retreats were authorized by senior officers, prompting his fury. Hitler soon rescinded all withdrawal orders and commanded troops to hold their ground at effectively any cost. Disagreements over this strategy led to the dismissal of numerous senior commanders including Guderian, Hoppner, Strauss, and Bock, and this further disrupted the German command cohesion and further sent the German army backwards. Soviet advances continued, especially in the north where Kalinin was liberated and German defensive lines were destabilized near Klin and Rzhev. Although some German units were able to avoid encirclement through last-minute withdrawals, their defensive structure was severely compromised. In the south, Soviet forces successfully relieved Tula and destroyed the German corps near it, weakening Guderian's southern flank and further destabilizing Army Group Center. Meanwhile, the extreme winter conditions continued to paralyze German air operations, temperatures plunged to record lows, and this created severe mechanical and logistical problems for the Luftwaffe. Although the Luftwaffe was later reorganized and managed to prevent a total collapse by supporting German withdrawals and supply efforts, its effectiveness was extremely limited when compared to the earlier phases of the campaign. In the central sector, Soviet advances were slower and hard-fought. Key towns were liberated by early January after intense combat, but exhaustion and overstretched supply lines forced the Red Army to halt major operations on the 7th of January 1942, having driven the Germans back between 100 and 250 kilometers across the front from Moscow. Despite Stalin's insistence on further offensives and attack, the Red Army could not successfully destroy Army Group Center, not yet at least. Nevertheless, the Soviet counteroffensive decisively shattered Hitler's hopes for a rapid victory, and marked the first major reversal of German fortunes on the Eastern Front. But that's just the story of what happened. Many of you already know it, and we are here specifically to talk about the British tanks. So the composition of the tanks involved in this counterattack was roughly about 45 to 50% T-34s, about 10% were KV-1s, and about 30% were T-26s and BTs. That leaves the remaining 10% being the British Matilda IIs and Valentines. Now, one key thing to point out here is those older tanks that make up the 30%, they're effectively useless against larger German armour, giving extra importance to the T-34s, KV-1s, and of course the British tanks. Several Soviet tank brigades operating in the Moscow region received British tanks in time to participate in combat. These units played supporting yet pivotal roles in halting the German advance and launching local counteroffensives. This includes the 146th Tank Brigade, which according to records was one of the most notable formations equipped with British tanks. It received a number of Matilda IIs prior to its engagement in the Klin and Volomysk sectors during November and December 1941. These areas witnessed fierce engagements as German forces attempted to secure key road and rail lines leading into Moscow. The heavily armoured Matilda IIs proved resistant to many German anti-tank weapons at typical combat ranges for the region, and this allowed them to support infantry assaults and stabilise defensive positions. The Matilda IIs were incredibly vital in this position. Any other tank, and it's pretty likely that they, one, wouldn't be able to be used in force, or two, wouldn't be able to stand against the amount of crap that was being thrown at them. The 131st Tank Brigade was also issued British tanks. This time it was Valentines though, and it was engaged in defensive and counter-offensive actions along the northern approaches to Moscow. The Valentine's compact profile and relatively reliable mechanics made it well suited for operating in the forested and snow-covered terrains that characterise this sector, and it performed reliably well against German forces. Two more units equipped with British tanks were the 136th and 150th Tank Brigades. These brigades were also reported to field British tanks in smaller numbers by late 1941. The 136th Brigade is documented as using a mix of Matildas and Valentines, while the 150th Brigade primarily employed Valentines in operations towards the Cullinan direction. Though their British vehicles were few, they served as valuable reinforcements that allowed Soviet commanders to compensate for shortages in domestic productions. Matilda IIs in particular were vital. British tanks would also see limited service with the 1st Guards Tank Brigade too, but this was on a much smaller scale. Overall, though, it's important to question how these tanks performed, particularly given how different they were. To start with, the Matilda II was an infantry tank designed for methodical support of foot soldiers rather than rapid maneuver warfare. Its defining feature was heavy armour. It was resistant to many of the German 37mm anti-tank guns, which earned it the respect amongst Soviet crews. However, its slow speed and limited manoeuvrability were significant drawbacks, particularly in fluid and mobile engagements typical of a counteroffensive on the Eastern Front, meaning that the tank was incredibly good at holding positions, not so good at attacking and assaulting them. Cold weather further complicated the operations too, because the Matilda's engine and transmission systems were not optimized for the extreme winter conditions, and Soviet mechanics often had to improvise modifications, but despite this, the Matilda provided invaluable armoured support and protection, and Soviet Matilda II crews were massive fans of the tank. They genuinely loved it. The Valentine though, well, this is the big one because it's so very important to our story today. The Valentine tank was generally more favourably received by Soviet crews than the Matildas because it featured reliable mechanics, good armour protection for its weight, and a small silhouette that made it harder to detect. It was also faster. Its primary shortcoming though was the 2-pounder gun, which lacked a high explosive shell, and this limited its effectiveness against infantry and other fortifications. Nonetheless, the Valentines excelled in support and reconnaissance roles, and durability in winter conditions made it a dependable asset during the Moscow campaign. The Soviets loved the Valentines so much that they would eventually receive over 4,000 of the type. The Soviets would attempt to gut-gun the tank, but this never really worked out, and in the late 1943, outside of recon, it largely fell out of use, being replaced by the newer and larger tanks being sent via lend-lease, and of course the upgraded T-34s. Although British tanks made up a minority of the forces that pushed the Germans back at Moscow, it cannot be denied that they played a vital role. Like I said, up to 10% of all the armour in the counteroffensive at Moscow was British. The USSR was beaten, not defeated, but beaten and bruised by 1941, and they needed support. The decision by Britain to support the USSR against the Nazis proved to be one of the most pivotal actions during the period. It was only through lend-lease support, and a lot of Soviet blood that the Germans would be pushed back from Moscow, and at the centre of that were crucial formations using British tanks given to the Red Army. In the Western and Cullinan fronts, Matilda and Valentine tanks operated alongside T-34s and KB-1s, forming composite armoured groups. Their presence, while limited, expanded the operational capacity of Soviet brigades and provided additional armoured mass that could be concentrated at decisive points. Though they did not transform the battlefield alone, these British tanks contributed to the broader momentum that eventually forced the Germans into a costly retreat, marking the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. Beyond their limited combat utility, British tanks carried symbolic weight because their presence signalled that Allied support was there when the Soviet Union was largely standing alone on land. Because, you tell a Soviet soldier at the time, yeah, the British are fighting them in North Africa, while they're sitting there defending Moscow, they're not going to give a crap. They're going to go, yeah, that's great, they're fighting in Africa, I'm fighting in Moscow. But if you give them a tank, and you say, this is from Britain, it shows them that they're not alone. Of course, today, it's very fun to rag on Tearboos when it comes to tanks. But it's often very misplaced when you actually open a history book and you see what armoured boxes made by Gary, Barry and Dave in a shed in Little Dickington could actually achieve. So with that all said, did the British tanks save Moscow alone? No. But they sure as hell were there when they were needed. And in many ways, that is how lend-lease helped save Moscow. That's not going to save me from the feral comments, is it? Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, enjoy Tankmas, and I will catch you all next time.